Red Bull just discovered something that should not be possible. They copied Mercedes. The same engine concept. The same thermal trick. The same compression idea that can unlock up to 40 extra horsepower during a race. And still, they're nowhere near them. Which means one thing. The real advantage was never just the trick everyone is talking about. And that's where this gets serious. Because if two teams use the same idea, and only one dominates, then something else is happening. Something bigger. Something hidden inside the system itself. And here's the part that changes everything. The FIA already checked these engines. Already approved them. Already said they are completely legal. So how do you beat a team that isn't breaking the rules, but still can't be matched? Red Bull believes they've just found the answer. And if they're right, then what we've been watching this season is only the surface of a much bigger advantage. Subscribe now, because what Red Bull uncovered makes this story even more insane. Red Bull didn't expect this outcome. That's what makes this so important. Because they didn't approach Mercedes as outsiders. They approached them as equals. Engine builders. Problem solvers. Teams capable of finding the same solutions. And for a moment, they believed they had. Because when Red Bull engineers analyzed the concept behind the Mercedes engine, they saw it clearly. The thermal expansion. The controlled change in compression. An engine that behaves one way when it's cold and another when it's racing. So they did what any top team would do. They built it. Their own version. Their own interpretation. Their own answer. And on paper, it worked. The numbers aligned. The compression increased under heat. The theory was correct. Everything pointed in the right direction. But Formula One is not one on paper. It's one on track. And that's where everything fell apart. Because when Red Bull ran their engine in real race conditions, the performance wasn't there. Not in the same way. Not with the same consistency. Not with the same impact. And that's when confusion turned into something else. Concern. Because if the idea is correct, if the physics is the same, if the concept works, then why is only one team dominating? That question is what led to the real discovery. Because Red Bull stopped focusing on the concept and started focusing on the execution. And that's where the gap appeared. Because thermal expansion is not just about heat. It's about control. Precise control. At a microscopic level. Every material inside the engine expands differently. Every component reacts to temperature in its own way. And unless you control all of it perfectly, the result is unstable. Inconsistent. Unpredictable. Which is exactly what Red Bull experienced. Their engine gained performance. But not always. Not at the same point. Not with the same strength. And in Formula One, that's not enough. Because an advantage that appears sometimes is not an advantage. It's a risk. But Mercedes didn't have that problem. Their performance wasn't inconsistent. It was precise, repeatable, controlled. And that's the difference that changed everything. Because Red Bull realized something very simple and very uncomfortable. Mercedes didn't just discover the trick. They mastered it. They engineered it to a level where it behaves exactly the same. Every single lap. Every single race. Under every condition that matters. And that kind of precision is what creates dominance. But here's where the story goes deeper. Because once Red Bull understood that execution was the key, they asked a more dangerous question. What makes Mercedes able to control it so perfectly? Because that level of control doesn't come from one component. It comes from a system. A complete integration between everything inside the car. Engine, cooling, materials, energy recovery, software, all working together. All designed from the beginning as one single concept. And that's what Red Bull just found. They didn't find a trick. They found a philosophy. A way of building performance that doesn't rely on one advantage, but on how every advantage connects. And that changes everything. Because now, even if the FIA removes the compression benefit, even if every engine must stay within limits under all conditions, that doesn't erase the system. It only removes one layer of it. And if there are more layers, then Mercedes is still ahead. And that's the part that's now spreading through the paddock. Quietly, but rapidly. Because teams are starting to realize they're not just behind in performance. They're behind in understanding. And in Formula One, that's the most dangerous place to be. Because by the time you understand what you're chasing, the team ahead has already moved on. Which leads to the question that now defines everything. If Red Bull could build the same idea and still not match Mercedes, then what is the part they're still missing? And this is where everything Red Bull uncovered turns into something much bigger than just Mercedes. Because once they realized they couldn't match the performance, even with the same concept, they stopped asking how Mercedes built it and started asking when it actually works. Because that's the only place left where a hidden advantage can exist. Not in the idea, not in the design, but in the timing. And what they found is what changes everything. Because the Mercedes engine doesn't just gain performance randomly. It gains it exactly when the race reaches its critical phase. Not at the start. Not in clean, controlled conditions. But later. When temperatures are higher. When energy demand is greater. When the race is decided. And that detail is everything. Because Red Bull realized something most people miss. This isn't just about having more power. It's about when that power appears. Because if your advantage only shows up when it matters most, you don't need to be faster all the time. You only need to be faster at the right moment. And that's exactly what Mercedes is doing. They're not dominating every second. They're dominating the decisive ones. Corner exits that lead into long straights. Late race stints when others start to drop off. Moments where energy deployment becomes critical. That's when the gap opens. And once it opens, it doesn't close. And that's what Red Bull couldn't replicate. Because their engine produced gains. But not at the same moments. Not with the same precision. Not with the same control. And that's the difference between performance and race-winning performance. But here's where the discovery becomes even more unsettling. Because once Red Bull understood the importance of timing, they looked at something else. Energy. Not just how much is produced, but how it is used. Because data from the races reveals something very clear. Mercedes is not just generating more energy. They are deploying it better, smarter, more efficiently, at exactly the moments where it creates maximum impact. And that's not just hardware. That's intelligence, algorithms, control systems, real-time decisions being made in fractions of a second. And that's something you can't copy overnight. Because it's not just built. It's learned, refined, perfected over time. And that's when Red Bull reached the most important conclusion of all. The advantage isn't a single discovery. It's a system that has been evolving for longer than anyone realized. Which means something very simple. Mercedes didn't just arrive here first. They've been ahead for a while. And everyone else is just catching up to where they were. But here's where the pressure starts to build. Because now, the FIA is watching all of this unfold. Not just the compression debate, but the bigger picture. A performance gap that can't be explained by one factor alone. And that forces a decision. Because if the rules only address compression, but the real advantage is integration, then the problem isn't solved. It's only reduced. And that leads to the moment that now defines everything. June. Because when the new measurements come into effect, when engines must behave the same under real conditions, one layer of this advantage disappears. Or at least, it should. But the question Red Bull is now asking is the one nobody can answer yet. What happens after that? Because if Mercedes remains just as strong, just as controlled, just as dominant, then this entire story changes. Because it would mean the compression trick was never the real weapon. Just one part of something much bigger. And that's the realization that's now spreading across the grid. Quietly, but powerfully. Because for the first time, teams are starting to understand that they're not just chasing speed. They're chasing a system they don't fully understand. And in Formula One, that's the most dangerous position you can be in. Because by the time you figure it out, the team ahead has already gone further. Which leaves one final question hanging over the entire championship. If Red Bull found the same idea and still couldn't match Mercedes, then how far ahead are they really?